Okay, so I think we're back now.
Oh, right.
Um, yes, let me just re-double check this to be sure. Um, okay, yes, indeed, we are live after all of that unfortunate beginning. So I apologize for that. I don't know why the software did that, so I'll take full responsibility for that. But we are now live. So joining me today, once again, Michael Graziano. So can you say again, for those who might not know you, who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, my name is Michael Graziano, and I am a professor of neuroscience and psychology here at Princeton University. I've been here a long time, many years, more than 2 decades. I've done a lot of work on a lot of different areas of neuroscience, motor control, sensory processing, but more recently, really in the last 12 to 15 years, I've worked on this question of consciousness, of what is it? Why do we think we have really a whole collection of properties that people call consciousness? And can we understand it? Can we build it artificially? And is that a good or bad thing for us to do? And these are the questions that my lab and I study.
Very cool. Okay, so and you've been when you were working on your on the body schema stuff that you did previously, were you interested in consciousness? I mean, it didn't really come up until, like you said, there was a certain point at which your kind of the focus kind of changed. But I was wondering if there was a lingering or background interest during those days as well.
Yeah, I think everyone in neuroscience, probably everyone in psychology at some point is interested in consciousness. You can't help it. Actually, everyone on Earth with any ounce of self-reflective interest is interested in that question. So yeah, of course, I was always interested in it. I think one of the things that happened in studying um, the body schema and other aspects of movement control and representing the body is this realization of how important self models are
Hmm.
for the brain, and that morphed into this question of consciousness. And we walk around claiming to have lots of interesting consciousness properties, and I think that's a self model. That's us trying to come to grips with, understand, model what's going on in there. And so I think there was a point at which all the previous work kind of set me up to transition to the consciousness question.
Interesting. And so I guess I was wondering a little bit about if your background views on consciousness before you. I mean, you say in your book that you think, and in some other places as well, you think there's a kind of inevitability to the attention schema theory, which we're going to get to eventually at some point, I think. But I wonder if, like, your background before you started theorizing about consciousness, were you would you have thought of yourself as a physicalist, or would you not have thought of these issues at all, or just
I think that I had a range of ideas. So I I think had you asked me this question 20 years ago, I would have had a totally different answer. And I would not have thought deeply about it. And I would have said, oh, yeah, it's this thing, it's the feeling inside you, and this and that. And nobody understands it. And I would have more or less followed the same kinds of tropes that one hears a lot, that it's not understandable, nobody understands it. It's a feeling. It's not the physical processing of information. It's some adjunct that attaches to the information that's not physically measurable, and so on. And so I would have said all those things that everyone else says. I really think it was the act of intensively studying how the brain models itself
mhm,
and how those models are never accurate.
right?
They're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be useful and they're supposed to be simplified so that they're easy to compute on the fly. And what that means in terms of our understanding of ourselves or the world in general, all our understanding, everything we know, everything we think we know is based on models that the brain constructs. and those models are never accurate. And I think it was that one had to think deeply about that to or, arrive at um, that understanding. Yeah. So
Yeah. Okay. So because I mean, you talk a lot about the meta problem, and that's what it sounds like you were grappling with in your own uh, coming to study the brain and trying to reconcile it with maybe these ideas that you had before. Was like, why do we think consciousness is so mysterious?
yeah,
So that's what I was kind of curious about was exactly what you know your pre-theoretical conception of consciousness might be, because I think that's going to shape a lot the way that you think the theory of consciousness needs to shape up
yeah.
afterwards.
I don't know if I was. It's very hard for me to fully grasp what it means to be a physicalist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there may be some deep contradictions in those categories when you start thinking about them really carefully. Uh, so what does it mean to say consciousness is a physical thing? I don't know. Um, Arguably, the most physicalist theory of all is the most absurd theory that consciousness is like a ghost material, like
Yeah,
ectoplasm, magic ghost
exactly.
material, right? That's a physical thing. That's
Right.
a physicalist theory of consciousness. And um, whereas, the kinds of things that I deal with now are more questions of um, what is it that we think we have? What is it that the brain, how does the brain model itself? And in what ways is that model accurate or inaccurate? In what ways is that model really useful and important for our survival, our functioning? So the the more philosophical questions of is it a physicalist theory or not? Is it an illusionist theory or not? Actually, they start to become less important to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can see why some of it's really semantics in a certain sense, but sometimes the semantics matter, and what to try to clearly position the view we want to, maybe it doesn't fit neatly into these categories, but one would like to know, um, well, is there anything more than the brain and the way the brain functions necessary to explain consciousness? And I think on your answer is no.
That's right.
So that if that's what you that's sort of what I mean by physicalism. Of course, you can talk about basic particles and all that sort of stuff, and that's great. But I think at the fundamental level, at the psychological level, sorry, not at the fundamental level, but at the psychological level, the question is, can neuroscience come up with something that tells us about consciousness?
Yeah.
And so the people who aren't physicalists want to say no. And I take it that you want to say, well, either it's a confused question or yes.
That's
But I
right.
wasn't sure which one of those is the right one to get you to say. Maybe
Right.
what you're saying is you don't care which one.
Well, yeah, it is partly a confused question, but part of what I'm saying is the confusion is really interesting because the confusion is not so much scientists sitting around failing to grasp it. The confusion is built in.
Right.
It's sort of like as I've often used this analogy, it's sort of like understanding color, right? We process color, and Newton figured out that color is a mixture of all different, well, he didn't understand wavelengths, but there's a whole spectrum. But
Right.
color is constructed by the eye and the brain. Something Newton figured out that there's three primary colors, which are constructs of the eye and the brain. And the color that we see is not what's actually out there. And Newton is the one who figured out that white, that looks so pure and clean, is actually a mixture of all these different things. And so, you know, if you ask the question, if you imagine the hard problem of color, uh, how does white light get scrubbed clean of all contaminants and turned pure? Right. The answer is that's an incoherent question.
Right.
However, it's really interesting why that question comes up. And it says something quite deep about how the brain represents, the eye and the brain process and represent wavelengths and the spectrum of light. So it's not, you don't throw it away. You don't say, ah, it's incoherent, forget about it. What you
Right.
do is say, well, it's really interesting that it's incoherent in this complicated, weird way. Why? Why does the brain process it that way? What's the benefit of an incorrect, but really simplified and elegant model of that aspect of the universe? And I think that's kind of my perspective on consciousness. I'm happy with, I love the fact that it's so complicated and incoherent and magicalist, because I think those are baked into us. That's like how the brain evolves to model itself.
Hmm. So do you really think that it's like really part of the common sense notion of consciousness that it's kind of not physical or magical or something like that?
Yeah. When
But
when
go ahead. You know, fuck yeah. I'm sorry.
I was going to say when you press people on it. So we did a survey study a little while ago where we just asked people online, in your own words, what is consciousness?
Hmm.
And we got this huge range of responses and we sort of sorted them and categorized them. And most people think of consciousness as a perceptive kind of thing. It takes in and understands. Um, but it itself, the experience itself, is not physically describable. So you can't
Right.
measure its weight, you can't measure its hardness or its combustion temperature or things, physical attributes of it. You can kind of locate it in space because it's kind of located inside people. These are the kinds of concepts people attach to it. So it's non-physical in the sense it doesn't have a list of physical attributes one can measure about it.
Right.
But people think of it as there. So there are these concepts that seem very universal that people have about consciousness.
Yeah. So when people, I would wonder about this because I think probably before I started studying philosophy, I was a naive dualist. My default position was probably that it was, if I ever thought about it, that the mind was not the brain. I'm now not that way, and I sort of consider myself leaning more towards physicalism, if depending on if anyone cares about that. But nonetheless, so I sort of see both sides. But I wonder, like, when I naively, my old self thought, oh, the mind isn't physical. It's sort of like the way that a lot of people say humans aren't animals. And then because everyone says that, but they don't really mean that. They can't really mean that because humans are animals. It's just that they're a special kind of animal, which usually is contrasted with the rest. So we find it laborious to say non-human animals, and so just say animals. And then in the common mind, I don't know, that kind of just distinction gets reified or something. But couldn't something like that be happening here too? That when people are thinking, oh, that's not a physical thing, what they mean is that they're contrasting it with all these other things. Like I mean, you ask people if the wind is physical, and they come around to saying yes, but not automatically,
Yeah,
because they have to think about it for a second, like, okay, so what part of physical? I feel it, I guess, but I can't see it, taste it, etc. Or maybe you
yeah.
can taste it. I don't know, but anyway, so is that? Do you think it's more than that in the like general common sense view?
Um, I think you're getting at something that sounds right to me. So when there's a whole list of attributes that we think of as physical, and if something has all those attributes, okay, that's a physical thing, like a rock has hardness and it occupies space, and you can bash it onto things and so on, and you can heat it up and cool it down and do all kinds of other things to it and measure all these properties. Wind, in people's experience, is missing some of those properties, but it has some of them. And so it's not quite as physical seeming in
Right.
people's cognitive categories. So, what kind of representation do people have of their own consciousness? Effectively, their own um, high level attentive processing of things in the world. What kind of representation do they have? The attributes they tend to attach to it, well, they think of it as having a location usually because it's kind of floating inside me. They think of it as doing stuff, like it allows me to understand and to make decisions, but it lacks all the other physical properties in people's concept, right? So there's neurons. Now we know, people know there's neurons that might be related to it, but neurons aren't it. It is something floaty. It doesn't have um, a hardness, and you can't knock on it and hear the sound, and you can't measure its weight, and you can't do all these other things. So it's lacking almost all physical properties other than location,
Right.
and the ability to affect things in the world in the sense that it affects our behavior. So I think the brain builds these representations of things in the world, and some of those representations include a lot of physical properties, like for a rock. And so when we build a representation of wind, it has fewer physical properties attached to it. And this is something that has even fewer physical
Mm.
properties. So it's hard for people to say this is a physical thing. It's really, in a sense, a non-physical thing. I think that's what's going on.
Right.
And then, of course, on top of that, there's cultural layers and layers of belief in magic or belief in, you know, uh, whatever properties one attaches to the immortal soul. But those are culturally learned. I think
Right.
there's some things that are not. They're really built into us about how the brain understands its own internal processes.
Right. And I mean, I know we keep circling around the attention schema, but I think that's an important point is that just like the body schema, it's the model that it builds is automatic, out of our control.
Yeah,
And I think the phantom limb example is a really good example.
yeah.
And not to mention the rubber hand illusion, which I like the way you describe it, but I had that strong of I never got the finger moving version of it. So
Oh,
these things really are out of our control and impress us with their like reality,
yeah,
no matter what is there or not. And that gets, I mean, it brings me to something I was curious about your view because you talk a lot about there being representations, information in the brain. And that, so like, how would the brain know that it was conscious or something like that? Or what would, if you asked it, it would should say there's an apple, but it wouldn't say, you know, there's something that's like for me to see apple or anything like that, unless you did these other things. And so part of me is curious to know whether you think there could be, even in principle, a creature that was conscious that couldn't answer that question, that didn't have that extra thing attached? Or do you just think, like, is that conceptually not something that could happen, like a first order theory?
yeah. I think that if I'm right, if this theory is right, then what the creature would have is attention. Like it would have that property, but it wouldn't know that it has it because it wouldn't have a representation of it,
Right.
right? And so it would have the kind of base physical reality that gets recoded and represented in the brain as consciousness. So you could say of a creature with no body schema, does it have arms and legs? It might. But then you could ask, does it know that it has arms and legs? Well,
Mm-hmm.
no, it doesn't have a body schema, so it didn't represent those aspects of itself. And so in this attention schema theory, um, you could ask, does a creature have attention? Does it have an ability to focus its mind and deeply process things? And the answer might be yes. But then you could ask, well, does it have a schema or model, a representation of that process? Does it know that it's doing those things? And in that case, if it has no attention schema, the answer is no. So, um, and the distinction, the quirk here is that the schema is not terribly accurate,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you take the body schema, the creature with arms and legs, no body schema, it doesn't know it has arms and legs. But you could also take a creature that does have a body schema, but it's not a very accurate one. And then you start asking it, well, do you have arms? Do you have legs? And it says, yes, I have a giant arm that's the strongest thing in the universe. I don't know, whatever its weird body schema is telling it. Um, and now you have something that thinks it has magical attributes that it doesn't have, but it thinks those things because they're a model of something it actually does have.
Right.
So anyway, that's what I would say of this whole consciousness thing. Yeah, creatures can have that base reality, an attentive mind that can process things in depth. Creatures can also have a representation or model of that. And us humans, at least, have a model that's so simplified and inaccurate that when we report it, we describe it as, yes, I have a magic essence inside of me, the
Mm-hmm.
consciousness essence.
But so, like for example, the frog. I think a frog is an example of a creature that you say probably doesn't have the attention schema. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
I would think
So,
I would think not.
okay. So, but they do they have attention, um, uh, and they so from the point of view of the attention schema, if they don't have it, then they're not conscious in the sense of that they're not going to have this extra thing which is attached or whatever, which has some functional benefits, by the way. So it's good to have around. But from the point of view of the frog, there is no so there's no subjectivity or no. I mean,
Yeah,
because some people might want to say there's something that's like to be the frog. It's just not very complicated or very exciting, but it's all this other stuff about the world out there and the way it represents it. You
hmm
could be a physicalist about the frog and then say, so why not? And I'm not saying this because I think that. In fact, I harbor suspicions that you probably need more than just that anyway. But what is your reason for thinking that that's not enough to say there's some kind of consciousness there, something that
right.
it's like to be the frog snapping at the fly?
Yeah, I think what it really comes down to, there's a kind of a heart to this whole concept, this whole way of thinking. It's kind of like the center of that Gordian knot.
Yeah,
Um, that Never mind the frog for the moment, we'll come back to the frog. But for a person, everything we think we know about ourselves, everything, including our absolute certainty that we have the experience and the consciousness and the this and the that, everything we know derives from information in the brain, or we wouldn't know it. We wouldn't say it. We wouldn't think it. We wouldn't believe it. Um, all of that derives from information. Or, if you will, to put it differently, um, almost like a conservation law, if it's coming out of your mouth, that information must have been in here,
yeah,
otherwise it can't come out, right? So it's all information. Everything has to derive ultimately from information in the brain. So when you talk about your experience, I like apples, a favorite food, so I always write about them. But you look at this apple, uh, and you say it's an apple and it's red and it's there, and I have a subjective experience of what it's like to hold and look at the apple. What you're doing is the your belief there's an apple that obviously depends on representations of apples,
right,
but your belief that you have a what it feels like, that you have a subjective experience, that there's something more than just processing the apple, that belief must also depend on information of a type constructed in the brain. I consider that logically necessary. Um, and if you didn't construct that information, if you could go in the brain and sort of suck out all the neurons and parts that process that other kind of information, you would have this person with uh, for whom the whole consciousness thing becomes irrelevant, like it's just gone.
right.
Uh, so that's one of the crucial points, is that it all derives from information.
But could that
And
person
I
still be conscious though? So they would know it, but why couldn't? So I guess what I'm getting, because I like this is like the you're right, the Archimedean main argument that you present is that if you're going to say you're conscious, it's got to derive from some information in the brain. So
Yeah,
there's got to be something in there on which the belief is based.
yeah.
Okay. So I
So
agree, I'm with you
here's
there, but why couldn't it be consciousness on which it's
it
based?
could be, but here's the second part.
Okay.
Um, so now we provisionally accept, at least in following this argument, that the claims we make, whether about consciousness or otherwise, about anything, derive from information. Let's call this information model building.
Yeah.
Um, in the loosest sense, that's what the brain does. It builds models of itself and the world and this and that. Okay. Here's the second part, a contention that, or a proposition that I offer. All models in the brain are inaccurate. They're all wrong. They're all simplifications, all of them. Um, or as the statistician George Box is supposed to have said, um, all models are wrong, some are useful.
Right.
And I really like that quote. So the brain builds models. They're always simplified, cut corner, approximate, always. And so, if that's so, then we have this simple conclusion that all the consciousness stuff that we say and believe we have is derived from a model. The model, or maybe multiple models, the models are not perfectly accurate. So, whatever we do have, and let's presume we do have something in there,
Yeah.
whatever we do have is not really quite the same as the thing we think we have and claim to have,
Right.
right? So now we are, as scientists, faced with this much pared down question: what is the thing in the brain that we really have that leads to this inaccurate model, which leads to our claims of a kind of non-physical magical consciousness? And once you straighten that out, you realize the thing we actually have does not need to have all the properties that we think it has,
Right.
right? It doesn't need to have the non-physicality. It doesn't need to have the mystery. It doesn't need to have all these impossible to explain hard problem attributes. It could be something else. It could be something simple. We don't know what it is. I propose that it's attention, the brain's attention process. That's the thing we really have that gets represented in a mystical, simplified form that leads us to claim to have consciousness. That's an hypothesis, and it might be wrong, but um, I think the logic of the situation forces one into a particular perspective. There is something. It's different from how the brain models it.
Right.
And what we think we have is based on how the brain models it. And so that's to me the only workable logical answer to consciousness, that general framework.
If you wanted to keep it within the confines of what a brain can do.
Um, well, if you believe that our contention, my contention that I'm conscious and my belief that I'm conscious depends on the brain. If you believe that, everything else follows from that.
Yeah. So, I mean, not that I believe it, but I would say some people would believe that there's a kind of, mental quality which you can know about in a non causally information based way. So you have to at least deny that there is such a thing like that. And I mean, I'm fine denying that. I'm just saying that not everyone's going
Yes,
to be fine with that.
absolutely. So it all comes down, of these two initial propositions. The first one is that everything we believe and claim to be true, everything, no matter how certain we are of it, derives from information in the brain.
Hmm.
What That's principle one, and there are people who don't believe that.
Right.
But I do, as a neuroscientist, I think that's obviously true, and it takes disconnection from scientific truth to believe otherwise. That's what I would say. That number one, this is true, and proposition two is the brain's models are always simplifications, and you put those two together, and you get this general framework uh, for a theory, and then one can try to fill in the details, which is what we've tried to do.
So,
But yes,
but
that's right.
so I wonder what you would say to someone, and here I'm just curious about what your response would be to someone who's going to be like, more of a fan of introspection. So they
Mhm.
might say, look, when I taste this tea, which I'm on it's gone, you can't see what it is, but this winter tea is quite delicious. A certain nutmeg cinnamon combination that's quite ever so delightful. And when I
Yeah.
focus on that, like when I'm enjoying the taste of it, and I'm really just like, wow, this taste, and it's there. It seems like everything about the taste is, or from the point of view of it being an experience of taste, is there.
Mhm.
It's right there for me. And so what you're saying implies that I'm mistaken about that. That it's really the basis that the brain presenting a simplified model of something, but there is no like quality of tastiness that mixes this cinnamon and nutmeg in a certain way, that's not really there at all. And so first I wonder if like, do you think that it phenomenologically, not cognitively, but like experientially seems that way? And if there's any merit to this line of critique.
I think that. probably the most common argument in consciousness studies, philosophically especially, that I run into, that I've ever read, that I've ever seen. The most common argument goes something like this: I know it's there because I'm experiencing it.
Right.
Um, and whether it's the T, or some people say, well, I can poke myself with a pin and it hurts.
Yeah.
It's there. I
But
know it.
tea
Um,
is better than poking.
T is much better than poking. So I know it's there because I'm experiencing it. Right. I'm experiencing it right now, so I know it's there. The problem is the it that we're talking about is experience,
Right.
right? And so now you're stuck in a tautology. I know experience is there because I am experiencing it. I know A is true because A is true. It's true because it's true. And I think
I
that
mean, that's not
int
false. Tautologies
well,
are true.
yeah, I think what's happening is um, cognition is accessing deeper information. Always deeper information is supplying it with the same answer
Right.
over and over and over and over again. And it can't get out of that. And if you, I think it's in a sense similar. I don't want to compare consciousness to a delusion, because I think a delusion is a pathological state and consciousness is a really useful, important adaptation. But in a delusion, uh, people can get stuck in the same thing, when the wiring is messed up, where
This is the
cognitively
squirrel in
they
the head
the squirrel
example.
in the head, for example. Yeah, right. That the guy, and that's a bizarre, wonderful, and horrible example for the guy who actually believed that. But yeah, but just in general, delusions are people who are absolutely at a gut level certain that something is true, and when they introspect, their cognition is basically accessing deeper information constructed automatically, and that information is always the same, always coming back up into cognition and always telling them, "Yup, it's true. Yup, it's true," and they're stuck in that. They can't get out of that. One
Mhm.
can't escape. What one is trapped by the information available in the brain. So I think that's what's going on. That it's circular and uh, tautological to say it's true because it's true. Experience is there because experience is there. And I think one can't even think the thought without the brain having built some rich representation of what it means by experience and that it's
Yeah.
happening right now and so on. So I think it's self models. I think the brain is building self models. Um, but I hesitate to, I want to make sure it's clear. Many people will say, aha, so you think there's nothing there. There's no there.
Mhm.
But what I'm saying is there's presumably something there that the brain is building a model of. It's just that the model is not super accurate.
Right.
And so the thing we think is there is really different in many ways from the thing that's actually there.
It's as though in we had two we're bipedal like we really are, but the body schema represents us as being like a stump or something like that, and we're convinced that we're stumps, even though like what's there is
Yeah,
completely other than there is a
yeah,
body, it is a certain way, but if it was represented in a really weird way,
yeah,
that's how you would expect it to be, and you'd behave in that way.
yeah. And there are people who, have that exact problem, whose body schemas are really distorted. Uh,
Hmm.
and so they can't, I mean, there's so many examples of that, of very, very weirdly distorted body schemas that people are absolutely convinced that's what they have.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
objectively, they
so
don't.
part of me likes this argument. Part of me wonders, like, isn't it sometimes true that it's true because it's there? So if, I mean, just ordinarily, if I can't I use experience to justify that, I mean, why do I believe that there's tea on the table in front of me because I can see it is part of the reason, and then there's other stuff about reaching and grounding
Ah,
and
but here's the problem. Because you can see it, therefore there's T.
there's
Um,
something.
right. But what you're not saying is, how do I know I can see the T? Because I can see the T,
Hmm.
right? That would be much closer to a tautology. Um,
Right.
so the problem with the consciousness thing is that it's not separate evidence. It's I Um, the evidence that I have experience is simply that I have experience, and that I have a problem with. That I
Mm.
think is just a logic loop. It's a machine stuck in a logic loop. That's what I think it is.
I mean, I
I don't
certainly
think,
agree with you that a logic machine could get stuck in that loop, but I wonder why you think that I or you are stuck in that loop when experientially and not cognitively. I mean, so it just really seems that way, that there's something experiential there. And I know I believe it as well. And so, I think you're focusing on the cognitive aspect, which is good, but isn't there something on which that cognitive thing is based? And you say, yes, it's just not the way we think that it is. And even
mhm,
there, I would say, yeah, I agree. Which, in the business we would call weak illusionism for amongst the philosophers. And weak illusionism, I think almost everyone is committed to the idea that consciousness is not the way we
yeah,
ordinarily think it is. But that's different than a strong illusionism, which says
yeah.
there's nothing that it's like. And I think that's what gets people riled up, is that because, like,
Ah,
there is something that it's like. What it's like is this thing that we've been describing, this simple
mhm.
quality thing, and what you're saying isn't really there. So in a way, um, why are we focused on the lower level as opposed to where all the seeming stuff is located, which is
Uh-huh.
where the consciousness business would, that isn't that
Right.
where we should be talking about?
Well, uh, the seeming business. I mean, the fact that you are so convinced that there is a seeming and that there is a phenomenology and that there is an experience. Again, I would argue if you believe in neuroscience, that must derive from information in the brain. The fact that you believe those things, that you even think those things exist, that you are so certain they exist. Certainty, of course, is a computation. Uh, so all of that derives from information. It's not, I think the mistake people make is when they look at a phenomenon like sipping tea and having a taste, and they think that the image, the concept is that there's a phenomenal experience that just sort of appears and is part of the tea. And what I'm suggesting is no, if you're saying that, if you think it, if you believe it in your gut, no matter how uncognitively it seems, uh, it's because the brain has constructed information about phenomenology, about seeming, about experience, and then attached it to the T. And if it didn't do that, you wouldn't have any of that. You wouldn't have any of those thoughts or beliefs, and it'd be irrelevant to your life, and we wouldn't be having a conversation about it. So
That's
something
true.
must be computing that information in there, right? And so I think it comes to that.
So
And
I mean, I'm partially on your side. I'm mostly just trying to draw you out here, but I'm
yeah,
also generally struggling with this because let me try it from a different point of view. I wonder if we can bring our good Frenchman Descartes into the picture. So, what do you feel about this kind of idea of radical doubt? I mean, have you ever
yeah.
encountered any Cartesians before?
I have thought a bit of, I mean, I have my own views of poor old Descartes. Uh, one thing I note just superficially, Descartes actually doesn't talk about consciousness. He talks
Yeah,
about thought.
exactly.
And if you imagine, if you categorize thought as a type of information processing, then yeah, sure, we think. Of course, we think there are lots and lots of thoughts going on in there. And Descartes actually never really asked the question about subjective experience per
Hmm.
se, right? Because that really wasn't framed in that way back then. So that's one point that makes it a little more difficult to try to interpret Descartes in a modern sense. But you ask about this radical doubt.
Yeah,
Um, I would ask this question if I could of Descartes. You of course know the by now extremely famous thought experiment to try to capture the Cartesian viewpoint. Imagine your brain is in a vat and
yeah.
aliens are manipulating it with electrodes, and everything you think you know is not really true. How would you know the difference? Here's what I would say to Descartes. What if you think that you've come up with a perfect, airtight, logical syllogism, But every time you think through it, the alien decides to screw with you and sends a little spark of electricity to your logic circuits and makes you leap to some totally illogical conclusion, but you would never know it, right? And so, what if it's true that everything you think is true is false? What if your logic is wrong? What
It's
if
true.
the
He sort of deals with that, but he tries to anyway, not in a good way, but in his, namely, I don't want to think about it way. But I agree. That's a point. If any case, any time there's step by step reasoning, you're subject to the evil genius coming in and messing with you. Descartes pretty much
Yeah, that's
agrees
right.
with you.
So he
Yeah.
says, I think, therefore I am. Sounds good, sounds logical, but what if it isn't? Right? If you're
Right.
really going to introduce radical doubt, then the truth is we know nothing. Of course, maybe we don't know nothing. We don't even know if we know nothing. Well,
Right.
if what once you basically what I see Descartes doing is saying if you accept no assumptions, what can you conclude? And the answer is nothing, because conclusions always rest on assumptions. So
Yes.
I have a bit of problem with Descartes, which strips everything
Interesting.
out, and then there's nothing left, and then we're nowhere.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, interesting. And I want to follow up on that, but also I want to keep us sort of on track. But because I was thinking of more of the more modern interpretation of Descartes, where this could be where you sort of think yourself to the point where right now you could be in a dream, and you say, okay, so if I'm in a dream right now, then there's not really a cup of tea here that I've been talking about. And then you think to yourself, okay, well, we replace the dream with some brain in the vat scenario, or even further, the ultimate step, replace that with there's nothing physical at all, just minds. And then Descartes says, aha, and something interesting is supposed to follow from that. Or Cartesians who like this more modern interpretation of it. But it sounds like what you're saying is that you don't trust that step anywhere along the process. That you don't
no,
think so you can't get yourself to the point where you're like thinking seriously that this right now could be not physical.
I, I so I think that there is a sense in which I am not certain of anything and can't be because of arguments like the Descartes argument or the brain in the vat. And yeah, that's true. And I don't really know if I walk out the door, maybe I'll just see a giant weird desert landscape with desert worms everywhere. I don't know. I mean, the
Ah,
last time I
Dune,
looked, it was
cool. Or
yeah,
Beetlejuice.
exactly. Beetlejuice. It looked like a corridor the last time I looked. I think if I even did that and if the memory wasn't implanted, right? I don't really know anything. But if you take some minimal assumptions, which I think we all have to do to get anywhere, there's a level of doubt that's just not useful.
Right.
And so the
But
worldview in which, yeah, that I exist in is essentially one where I trust evidence and basic logic, and I've decided that that's okay.
yeah.
And within that world, then I'm perfectly willing to accept that this is not illusion. I mean, my brain is built a model of the world that's not accurate. I'm sure that this is not the way the world really is in some objective sense, but it's a representation of it that's reflective of the real thing.
Mhm.
And so I accept basic reality of the outside world and the inner world.
Right. Yeah. And the only reason I was bringing that up was to kind of get you to talk about whether you think that there is a sense in which, at that minimal level, we can talk about experience. Because the way that I would interpret, or lots, and not only, I mean, who cares about Descartes? But a lot of people would interpret the, cogito, I think, therefore I am, as really something to do with experience, that I experience, therefore I am. That's really what's at the bottom of it is that, I'm seeing, I'm thinking, I'm willing, I'm doubting. Those are all experiential terms. And so there is a sense in which, even though I'm, lean towards physicalism, I sort of feel like, yeah, right now, could I imagine a movie where this was happening in some sort of non-physical realm? And I think it's not conceptually absurd, but it sounds like, and there'd still be experiences of tables and chairs and so forth. And it would be, there was a Robin Williams movies where he sort of almost had this as a plot. He goes into a painting, I think it was called What Dreams May Come. That's kind of irrelevant. However, the point is, it's not conceptually absurd, but it sounds like on the attention schema view, like on your view of consciousness, that we can't even get to that point where we can kind of start from this experience first sort of position.
Yep.
And maybe
Yeah,
that's a good
that's right.
thing on your view, but a lot of people would see that as like starting from a you start backwards or inside out or something. So I wonder how
It
you.
it it could be, but I think the brain processes a massive amount of information, only a small amount of which ever enters or touches what we call experience. And why do we say that we have these experiences of some things and not others? And I always come back, I know I'm just repeating myself here, but I always come back to that same proposition. If you believe in neuroscience and basic science and logic, which I accept are assumptions, but I decide to take in those assumptions. If you accept that basic platform to build on, then the our certainty that we have experiences derives from information in the brain, and everything else flows from that. There's got to be something in there. I've
Right.
been very interested in the link, in particular, to social cognition, right? Because we evolved to look at other people and interpret them as having minds with experiences and thoughts. And if you sucked out all the social cognition parts of the brain, all the theory of mind parts, I wonder, does that mean you have a person who just no longer even comprehends mind, for which the very concept of mind and experience is just like irrelevant, gone, nothing? You
Yeah.
know, when you ask people, tell me about experience, your experience itself, what part of the brain are you asking? I mean, you're asking the parts of the brain that know what that is, that know what that concept is. So you're asking theory of mind circuitry in the brain. And so it gives you an answer. It gives you the answers that it knows that it's evolved to process.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, but couldn't the I mean, I wonder why you resist saying that the thing of which it's a model is consciousness. And it's just that consciousness is different because of, we think of it as being different than it is because of the way it's modeled in the brain, which would be a sort of straightforward physicalist interpretation of your view. But in many places, you seem to resist that and
Uh-huh.
say, no, it's yeah, there's something there, but it's not consciousness. Um,
Well, I don't know what words to put on it. Uh, so to give you an example, a really concrete example, you sit in a room, you look at a chair, and your brain builds a model of chair, and you say, there's a chair. And we all know that the model is not perfectly accurate, and that the real chair is different from the model, and the thing that you say is there is not really quite the same as the thing that is there.
right,
And we've all collectively decided to call them all chairs. Like the real thing is a chair, the thing being modeled in the brain is a chair, and the thing we say is there is a chair. And one could dice it and slice it philosophically and say, no, they're all different from each other, which is true. But we still call it all the same word. And so, if you wanted to, sure, you could call it all consciousness. You could say, yeah, we have consciousness in the sense that the brain is capable of uh, focusing in and deeply processing some things over other things,
hmm,
like the global workspace style, pull all this stuff together, the most essential pieces of information into one central processor that can then influence the rest of the brain. The brain can do that. That's real. That's there. Well, let's call that consciousness. Then there's the thing the brain thinks it has because it's built a model of that process. And the thing it thinks it has all these bells and whistles and properties that we report having. Well, let's call that consciousness too. So if you want to, we can attach the word consciousness to it. Um, I'm just saying that as far as I know, there's pretty good evidence actually that I think at least when I look at the evidence, that when we talk about our consciousness, the things we're conscious of and the things we're not conscious of, um, they map on really well to the things that the brain is paying attention to and the things the brain's not paying attention to,
hmm,
right? So it just kind of looks to me like the thing that's really there is attention. And the thing that we say we have, that is the model that's been built of it, that's the thing that we call consciousness. That's that's what
right.
I that's what I think is going on.
Okay. I mean, yeah, it's interesting because it sounds like you sort of have like an attention theory of consciousness with like a attention schema theory of the meta theory of consciousness for why we think consciousness is a certain way when it isn't. Um, uh, but yeah, okay, so I mean, I still can't, myself personally, I can't really, I mean, I see how if I'm going to say or believe something, it's got to be based on information in the brain. And that
Yeah,
information may just be what consciousness is. But I also sort of think that we should allow that there could be just consciousness without this other thing attached to it, or at least that that should be possible in some sense. That it should be an open question whether the frog is having an experience in the full
right,
fledged sense, not as complicated as mine, but in a phenomenal
right.
sense,
So,
regardless of its status or not. But it sounds like it almost comes down as conceptually like defined by your theory that the answer has to be no because of this like airtight logic kind of case, which sort of seems to seem, I don't know, it delivers the wrong. Seems like it should be an empirical result rather than like a logical result that the frog doesn't have experience or something.
well, let's think of it this way. Let's say the frog has experience, um, but we want to understand. Let's say we want to understand how it is that people think they have experience and claim to have experience and talk about it and introspect and say, "Ah, I have it," and then they report on it. Okay. Um, there's what's a good way to put this? Um, go back 500 years before people knew anything about the brain. And you can ask, did people have serotonin or let's say, um, uh, glutamate, uh, in their brain, neurotransmitter? Uh, yes, um, they had it. There it was. But people didn't say they had it. They didn't know they had it. They didn't talk about having it. They didn't report having it. So there is a disconnect between having it and that whole ability to know you have it, think you have it, believe you have it, and talk about it.
Right.
Right. So there's a kind, in that instance, there's a disconnect. Um, so if we want to try to understand how people say they have consciousness, believe they have consciousness, talk about, argue about it like we're doing, what I'm saying is, and I think you've said this makes sense, that it derives from bundles of information in the brain that
Yeah.
are models, self models, right? Once you've got that explanation, you don't need the actual feel. Maybe it's there, maybe it's not, but there's no proposed mechanism for how that actual feeling specifically influences the neural circuitry such that the brain builds information about it and then talks about it. And so I would put it this way.
Hmm.
Um, there's a view of, for example, of how objects behave. For example, you take a drinking glass and you drop it on a hard tile floor and it shatters. There's kind of two classes of explanation. One is the glass got mad and was so emotional about it that it decided to break up. All right, so it's the intentionality hypothesis of the behavior, and the other one would be a more Newtonian. The forces from the strike exceeded the integrity, the forces holding the glass together. Uh, now, you could successfully argue that those two are not incompatible.
Hmm.
Just because you've explained that dropping the glass, Newtonian forces shatter, just because you've traced it all back to that, doesn't mean the glass didn't actually feel angry. Maybe it felt angry. Okay. And I would say that's true. You have a point. But that is not a necessary part of the explanation for any of the behavior. Now, I prefer to use Occam's razor and say, forget about that. You don't have to. You can believe the glass had a feeling, but I would say logically, you can't believe that the glass's feeling caused it to break because the breaking is already fully explained. And
Right.
so I would say in the consciousness debate, maybe we have this conscious experience and feeling, but it is not what's causing us to say we have it, believe we have it, or claim we have it. That is information in the brain in the form of these models that are automatically built that are self descriptive. And those models are there to describe real processes that need to be predicted so that the brain can successfully control itself.
Hmm.
Okay. And so go ahead, believe that there's the conscious feeling. That's great. All I'm saying is it's not what's causing us to say we have it and think we have it and believe we have it, which is a totally different process.
And that's related to the attention schema in your view, that other process.
That's right. So this is the hypothesis we put forward is that in specific, the crucial model that leads people to say they have consciousness is modeling attention, a kind of high level attention.
So I wonder
So,
if I switch topics sort of slightly, but not hopefully too much. Do you have any thoughts on how the models in the brain get implemented? Because some people might, and again, I'm not necessarily one of these people, but I'm curious about what your response is. They might think, look, we're helping ourselves to too much stuff here. We're talking about models, we're talking about information, but what we really have are neurons.
yep.
So aren't these things already of like a different class, so to speak? That we need a story about how they get implemented in the brain, so that we're trying to eat a cake and have it as well.
Yeah. Uh, I think that the answer to that will be um, artificial networks, neural networks.
Hmm.
And that's why this is such an interesting topic to me and something that my lab is working toward. How can we build these things into artificial systems? What does it even mean to build models in neural network architectures?
Do,
And
do, do you think that our current AI systems have models? Like I know there's some debate about Chat GPT and those type of things, whether they even are generating models of things or not.
I think, yes, these things have models. They, when you look at ChatGPT, I mean, it's a big mystery box, and somewhere in there, there's um, implicit distributed information in the form of connection weights that amounts to predictive models of things in the world, and it's learning these information structures. And so, I think ChatGPT has certain kinds of models. One of the things we've done is asked how good are its models of other people's minds.
Hmm.
In other words, how good is its theory of mind? And it turns out it's really good. Um, Chat GPT-4 has theory of mind that exceeds most people. Um,
Wow.
so
Yeah.
it's it's
Have
it's
you done the
it's
kind of experiments that you done with human subjects on ChatGPT 4? Or
yes. So we do have a paper that I've been collaborating with that looks at standard tests of social cognition applied to human populations and applied to ChatGPT and a couple others of these um,
wow.
machines. And some of them do a little less well than people. Some do terribly. Some do much better. But ChatGPT 4 has extraordinary ability, and I don't think it can do that unless somewhere buried in there in an implicit form, it has good predictive models of what a mind is, how a mind contains information. What does it mean for another person to think this and therefore be able to act this and that way? So it's building models.
Hmm.
I don't think that it has a model of itself in the same way that people do because it's not trained on that kind of thing.
So interesting. So do you think that well, these models are going to result in a kind of implicit or explicit even beliefs, which might lead to these machines saying or thinking that they have consciousness in a way that we do?
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible, but I think you probably have to train it in
Hmm.
specially, right? I do not subscribe to this very old, long-standing idea that if you just make it complicated enough or train it enough, then eventually it'll spontaneously develop the consciousness thing. I think
Yeah.
it's much more specific.
The Star Trek
Yeah,
Voyager theory of consciousness.
right, exactly. Yeah,
Got
I
enough
think it goes.
information, it became conscious. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
But couldn't it
Um,
happen spontaneously though? I mean, because in our case it did, per your argument that if it has to control something, a model is useful for control. Then it
yes,
seems like these sorts of
yes.
things may sort of develop on their own if we're not careful.
Yep, I think they may develop on their own. I think I mean, well, so we come back to the attention schema theory, and I always try to point out it's a specific theory within a larger framework.
Mhm.
And when I talk about inevitability and, logical certainty on my end, at least, I'm talking about the larger framework. The specific theory says that um, it's focused high level selective attention in particular that is being predictively modeled by the machine, which leads us as machines to think that we have all kinds of properties like consciousness. Okay, so that's the framework. Um, I think right now, um, artificial agents don't have the same kind of attention that we have, and therefore they were probably never, as they stand right now, would not develop the same kind of self models that we have in that
Mhm.
respect. We could build that stuff. Um, I think that it's probably easily buildable. It's within 10 years we could have this stuff, or sooner probably. It's just a matter of building it.
Hmm.
And I also think that because one of the main uses of consciousness for people, and I think this is not fully appreciated, one of the main uses of consciousness is that we attribute it to each other. And it's part of our social matrix that we live in, our the social atmosphere, the world that we swim in an ocean of perceived consciousness, and it allows us to get along with each other. And it's one of the tricks I think evolution came up with to make us a pro-social species.
Hmm.
And so there may actually be a benefit to building some of the stuff into our machines so that they're not just all big sociopaths.
Yeah. So is it really the attention schema rather than a certain sort of schema that matters for your view? Because I'm wondering now, as I hear you thinking, I was thinking, couldn't ChatGPT 4 have a different kind of schema modeling something other than attention, whatever it has, but in a way that describes it in a shorthand, which convinces
Yeah,
it that it has this non-physical essence, which we
yeah,
would then say, I guess that's so it could be any. I mean, even you couldn't you have a body schema, just a body schema that described the body as a non-physical thing, and then you would think you
yeah,
were a ghost or something. So it
yep.
seems like it's a schema theory rather than attention. Like it's not really attention that
Well,
matters as
that's
much as the way the schema describes whatever it's modeling.
yes. I hypothesize that the attention is crucial to the experience claim,
Hmm.
right? To experience something is the brain's shorthand of saying, I'm paying attention to it. That's the theory. But you're right. You can have schemas of all kinds of other things in your brain. And the body schema is a perfect example because the phantom limb shows that the body schema uh, so you lose your arm, your body schema says no, you still have an arm. It's a ghostly thing, but it's there. It's immaterial, non-physical arm that's still there.
Hmm.
So you're right, you can have schemas that tell us things that are physically incoherent, um, that are ghostly, that are magical. So there's all kinds of possibilities in there, and you're right, artificial agents could develop their own, effectively their own form of consciousness. I'm not sure that it would be experience in the same sense that people claim to have experience.
Hmm. So what do you mean
But
by experience? The specific like phenomenalness of it?
yes,
Hmm.
the yes, but I think that's all buildable. I
Hmm.
think, or trainable, let's say, and I think that that'll get sorted out. People will build the stuff for
So do
better
you
or
think it has
worse.
any moral implications for how we treat these machines?
Um, I think we start getting into the real details of morality this way when you really start building things, right? And then you get into these questions like, what even is morality?
Hmm.
I mean, there's wonderful theories that link it to emotions and evolution of emotions. And now you have these machines that have no emotions that we know of because we don't even know how to, we don't understand emotions in the human brain and we don't know how to build them into machines. And so you start asking questions like, okay, maybe we make it conscious, but it has no emotional association with anything, so it doesn't care whether it lives or dies. Is it okay to kill it? Um, I it certainly becomes ethically complicated, let's just
Yes.
say.
Okay. But and you might wonder whether it's ethically complicated to even start working towards creating something which we thought could be a conscious artificial agent.
Yes, I think that's going to happen anyway.
You think people can't resist?
I think people, yeah, I think that's technology for you.
Okay. So I want to just make sure that we connect what we were just talking about back to how it got brought up, which was how models get implemented in the brain. And so what I take to be your answer is that for anyone who thinks we're helping ourselves to too much, we can see that we aren't by looking at what these systems are doing by
Yeah.
building something like a brain, getting these sorts of properties out of it strengthens our idea that the brain itself can have these sorts of things going on. Is that the general
Yes.
idea?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I wonder then what you might say to someone who thought, look, what's really going on is, well, I mean, you build the physical basis of it and then the non physical thing happens. So that there's some sort of law-like connection between so I'm channeling someone like David Chalmers or someone who's perfectly fine with all the information stuff, 100% happy with it, but also thinks there's some law of physics or not physics, law of nature, which
Hmm.
connects information states to these abstract qualia states that are not physical.
Hmm.
And then I guess what if I would sort of guess what your feeling would be, it'd be like, what's the point of those things? They're not doing anything for us. But
Yeah.
is that the kind of critique you're gonna?
Yeah, they're non-explanatory parts of the theory. I compared it once to, the medieval humors theory.
Yeah,
So, I don't know if you read that one article on
I
on
have.
on phlegm
Yeah.
that
Well,
people are
my website
phlegmatic.
has the tagline "The Usual Phlegm in Philosophy," from which, yeah, it's not from
Ah,
your article, but I love the humorous theory. It's hilarious.
yeah, there you go. So yeah, the theory was, or part of the theory was, people get sluggish because they have too much phlegm, and phlegm is a sluggish flowing fluid, so therefore they must get sluggish. And that's a really kind of analogical kind of thinking. But you have to ask yourself, what is the mechanism by which having too much of a particular kind of liquid makes you psychologically more like that liquid? Uh, and that specific connection is not apparent. And
Yeah.
so one has to ask the question, having conscious feeling, what's the connection between that and specifically neurons processing information such that you think and believe and claim to have conscious feeling? What's the connection from one to the other? Right? We spend so much time trying to explain how neurons produce the conscious feeling, but
Mhm.
nobody ever addresses what I call arrow B. How does the conscious feely thing turn around and affect the neurons in such a specific way that we can say that we have it, right?
Right.
That remains totally unaddressed. And you don't need it. You don't need the extra feely thing to explain the whole full behavior of the system.
Yeah, and then
So,
I guess what they would say is you need the extra feely thing to explain like my introspective access to it, and then you would say, yeah, but that's already like a simplified illusion sort of thing anyway. We don't need to explain that.
yeah, my theory explains why you, meaning David Chalmers, are so certain that my theory is wrong.
Right. I mean, it does sort of seem that you get to a point where there's just kind of like a bedrock impasse here, and each side has a sort of diagnosis of the other side and why they don't accept, their view, and then there's nothing really you can do past that. I mean, you get to the point where you can say, look, you say that because you're stuck in a loop, and then he's going to say that you look, you're saying that because you're too committed to physicalism and are trying to explain away the obvious thing, and then it's like where do we go from there? It's not really clear. I mean, from the science point of view, it doesn't matter because all the science continues as it was anyway. But
Yeah.
like, is there? Do you think that this whole debate ultimately ends up panning out in kind of a frustrated like harumph, or is there a way to progress past this?
Yeah, here's how I think it will progress. When it becomes of everyday pragmatic importance to the average person. In other words, two things. One, when AI becomes so human-like that we automatically attribute consciousness to it. And people already do all over the world. They can't help attributing some degree of consciousness to AI, whether it has it or not. Uh, just like kids attribute consciousness to their stuffed animals. But there will come a point, I think, when AI is at such a level that people just say, yeah, okay, it's conscious. And then whatever, you know, went into the AI, people will have to accept, okay, that must be the consciousness thing. The second development, I think, ultimately will be mind uploading, which is much farther in our future and a real science fiction kind of proposition. But when you get to the point when you can copy the data structures in a human brain and put them in an artificial system, and then the person seemingly in this artificial world attests to still being conscious, there comes a point when it's sort of like the flat Earth, round Earth.
Yeah.
there there comes a point when trade routes got so important for everyone's everyday life that people threw up their hands and said, "Okay, fine, it's round."
Right. Yeah. I mean, you'd be surprised. Flat Earth is sort of making a comeback, but
That's true. That is true. But
that's a different topic. Let's not go down that road. But yeah,
yeah,
so you think it's going to be a pragmatic thing that there's not going to be some like dramatic headline consciousness illusion. It's just going to be, oh, okay, we can't help but treat that thing conscious. People already are doing this to their Roombas. I mean, God help us when these things have faces and are talking to us. We don't stand a chance, I
yeah,
feel like. So, of course, we're going to assume it's conscious. And then, mind uploading fully, I think you're right. If that ever becomes, my secret last refuge is that I wish that consciousness were biological in some sense, but it's hard to really maintain that view. But, anyway, so uploading, if that's possible, that's one thing. But even less dramatically, just any partial sort of neural augmentation. I mean, I think it's going to be when all it takes is for grandma to come home with an artificial hippocampus, and to because my grandfather had Alzheimer's, and if he'd ever come home from the hospital and suddenly looked at me like he knew me and said, "Oh, Richard, I recognize your voice," I would have been, would have made it would have floored me. So I think that when that stuff starts happening, that's going to be not. I mean, you don't need to go all the way into the computer simulation before you have real questions about is grandma seeing my
mm,
face? Does she really have visual
yeah,
experience? And when she says, "Oh," starts crying, "I haven't seen your face after having a cortical implant." So
yeah,
whether those things pan out, I don't know. But I like this idea that it's going to be sort of practical reasons that inspire us.
yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, because I would love it if there was some sudden headline that said the magicalists are all wrong. It's an illusion. I'd be like, yeah, I
Oh,
could. New York
cool.
Times, say it. But
Okay.
that won't happen, I don't think.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, it does sort of feel like at the end, it's just these are metaphysical questions and not science questions. So, there's going to be one side that says, look, everything you say is compatible with me still thinking there's this extra stuff. And you're going to say everything you say is compatible with me thinking it's not there. And then, I don't know. So it does seem a bit frustrating. Uh, I wonder if, like, I know I can't keep you forever, although I have a million things I want to badger you about. But I am thinking that when you were just really quickly, when you mentioned the ChatGPT thing, there would be no evidence, obviously, or no way of this thing coming up with this, like the beam theory of vision, right? Because this depends on this view that you have that there's some evidence that people have an intuitive idea that consciousness is like a force emanating out of the mind. That's not something that ChatGPT is going to come up with, is it?
So, right. So, just to give a little larger context for viewers, um, yeah, one of the things we've done is looked at some of the weirder, more irrational concepts, or not concepts, perceptions people have of each other's consciousness. And one of them is the beams coming out of the eye, which we hypothesize is a actually a useful simplifying trick for keeping track of who is attending to what, to
Mm-hmm.
model attention as though it were like an invisible fluid that flows out of the source to the thing that's being attended to. And indeed, we've collected a lot of evidence that shows that people do this at an unconscious level. And the visual motion areas are crackling away, representing attention as a flowing thing coming out of people's eyes, right? So now you ask, would ChatGPT ever come up with that? And here's the thing, ChatGPT has access to all human writing, basically, and probably more at this point, images and so on. And the I-beams are baked into a lot of our writing.
Hmm.
They're everywhere culturally. Um, so we talk about, the light of love coming out of people's eyes, and there's oodles of stuff written about how you feel the pressure of someone's stare on the back of your neck,
Right.
or he stared so hard at you that you had to take a step back, or,
If looks could kill.
Superman. Yeah, if looks could kill, or Superman has X-ray vision, and it burns holes in things, which makes no sense because X-ray vision really should be the X-rays go into your eye, not coming out as
Yes.
in a beam, right? So I think that ChatGPT probably already has some ability to grasp this concept of I beams, whether you know how, if you asked it about that, I'm presuming it would be able to give you answers like, yes, people sometimes believe it. So I think it knows about, I think ChatGPT knows about these fictitious I beams.
But do you think that it would be useful for it to employ that as part of its model of what other people are doing?
No, because I think it's not interactive in the same way. I think you got to build a machine that's in real time looking at a person and predicting where is that person paying attention to right now and how is that going to affect that person's behavior,
Right.
right? And when you build a system that's interactive moment by moment in real time in real space, then it becomes useful for it to build those kinds of models.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, well, there's many things, like I said, I want to ask you, but got to be mindful of that. You probably have better things to do than talk about consciousness with me all day.
No,
So I want to
absolutely
ask.
nothing better.
Okay, good. Well, then I want to know if, like, in the course of this discussion, anything that you were expecting to come up or wanting to talk about hasn't come up yet. So if there, the answer could be no, but in case there was something that you thought might come up, it hasn't. I was wondering.
No, no, I don't think so. I mean, we covered a lot of ground. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be covered, but nothing
Yeah,
specific
exactly.
pops into mind.
Okay, very cool. Well, I want to thank you for joining me today. And I want to also say that I really like your approach to trying to find a common framework. There's disagreements about how to do it from the scientific point of view, trying to move past all the infighting between the theorists and trying to provide something that looks like a combination or a building an understanding communally, which is something that's been lacking. So I really noticed that that's a theme of your work. And whether
Yeah,
you agree with how you put all the ingredients together or not, that's a separate issue. But the idea that we should be working together on this, I think, is very important. And so I really admire that in your work. And I know it's not, you probably meet some resistance with that. But I think we need people out there trying to say, look, how do these ideas all fit together, enough harboring our own
yeah.
little safe harbors. So keep up that good work, hopefully, and I would like to talk to you more about these experiments one day if they ever come out with the Chat GPT. So if you'd be willing, have you back for that. But other than that, thanks again, and hang around just for 1 second, and I'll say bye off air. But
All righty. Well, thank you very